If you're an old subscriber to the channel, you're clearly aware that blurring the lines between fiction and reality is something we love to do here when it comes to scary media. For horror fans, this is not surprising or strange because one of the main reasons we're fascinated with spooky stuff is that we have a deep intrigue about whether the stories we hear are based on someone's imagination or there's an actual connection to the real world. Usually, I emphasize this aspect by using horror games specifically as a primary example of how real-life events and places can be hidden beneath the fictional story and narrative. However, today, I'm going to delve into a different category in the world of horror that's been a source of mystery for people long before video games existed. I'm talking about urban legends, and for those who don't know the term, urban legends are modern, creepy folklore stories that spread from person to person without any verified source, but still feel believable enough due to their ambiguous nature that leaves room for some truth. Nowadays, people usually expect urban legends to be rumors, myths, or straight-up fabricated lies to drive hysteria or create engagement for whoever is making them up online. But on certain occasions, this is not the case at all. Over the last few decades, the idea of urban legends becoming reality has been increasingly more common, mainly because learning about events is much easier in the modern world, thanks to the internet and fast transfer of information. So in this video, I'm going to talk about several urban legends that were considered too shocking to be true at first, but then it was proven otherwise. Anyway, without further ado, let's start. In the last few years, there was a spooky story circulating across the internet that centers around an entity known as the Watcher. And in 2022, a horror movie with the same name was released, expanding the tale into a full narrative. The story simply talks about a family who buys their dream house and gets ready to move into it. But as they're preparing their belongings and bringing their packages, they begin receiving bizarre letters from a mysterious person. The letters are not written to just welcome the new family or congratulate them, but instead, they actually threaten them to stay away and avoid moving into the house because the property is under the surveillance of the Watcher. The Watcher says that the house belongs to him, and he's been dedicated to watching it day and night for decades, urging the family to be aware that they're always being watched if they choose to move in. Initially, many people online thought that the story was fake and someone made it up to gain attention on Reddit. But little did they know, both the story and the TV show are based on actual events that happened as recently as 2014. In June 2014, Derek Broaddus and his wife Maria managed to save enough money to buy their dream house, which was a 6-bedroom estate at 657 Boulevard in Westfield, New Jersey. The couple spent $1.3 million to buy the property, and they were very excited to move in with their 3 children and enjoy their new home. After finishing the purchase, the family started doing some renovations before officially moving in. And one day, the husband, Derek, went to see the mailbox. But instead of finding some generic stuff like bills or items he ordered, he found a thick, white square envelope sent simply to the new owner. Derek had no idea what was inside the envelope, and once he opened it, he saw that it was a typewritten letter. But the issue is that the sender is anonymous, and what's written in the letter is absolutely jarring. The letter starts with an opening that was deceptively normal and almost friendly, welcoming the family into the neighborhood. However, as Derek continued reading, the letter turned sinister very fast, with the writer claiming that the house has been the subject of his family for decades, and he's been put in charge of watching it. He mentions that his grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, his father in the 1960s, and now it's his time to continue this generational surveillance. When Derek shared the letter with his wife later on, he tried to remain calm and avoid scaring his children, potentially dismissing the whole thing as a joke from some crazy neighbor. He assumed that this letter was an isolated incident and nothing would happen in the future. But sadly, a few days later, he received another letter, and this time it was much worse and, frankly, dangerous. The letter mentions strange details about the house itself, including its history and the people who lived in it, But on certain occasions, the writer talks about what's happening in real time, such as the renovations taking place and the workers who come in. This led the husband to seriously panic and believe that this is not a joke anymore, because whoever is sending these letters is clearly close to the property and literally watching them from somewhere. Eventually, he decided to call the local police department, and when authorities began their investigation, their attention landed on the Langford family, the neighbors who had lived in the area for a long time. But after a thorough exploration and questioning, they didn't find evidence linking the neighbors to the letters or any suspicious activity surrounding the house, making the case more complicated than it already was. The problem is that the letters never stopped coming, and over the weeks, the family received multiple ones, and the writer always identifies himself as the Watcher. At some point, the tone became more terrifying when the Watcher began to talk about the children and how he plans to lure them to him, which was the most troubling part for the parents. All this happened before the family even permanently moved to the house, and when the Watcher showed obsessive interest in discovering where the children will sleep and which rooms will be used, the husband lost his mind, trying to figure out who's sending the letters. This was insane because the Watcher highlighted specific descriptions about the basement, recent activities from the children, the family's car, and personal information that prove he's actually watching the family and the house when he sends the letters. After months of examination from both the police and private investigators, the only evidence they found is the DNA that was recovered from the envelopes. And according to this clue, it was suggested that the sender is probably a woman, but it didn't match any suspect. Long story short, the Broaddus family never moved permanently to the house, and the parents were afraid of letting their children stay in it, especially since the letters remained a reality and the sender was still a mystery. Several years later, nothing changed, and authorities were unable to identify who the Watcher was, or why the letters were exclusive to this house, which ultimately forced the family to have no choice other than selling the property to escape this nightmare. They had a hard time finding a buyer because the letters haunting story was not something that any new resident would be happy to deal with. After years of desperately searching for a buyer, in 2019, they finally sold the house for only $960,000. Which was a huge loss compared to the $1.3 million they paid and the money spent on renovations.
Yeah, for years, so many thought nobody would buy this house because of all that negative publicity with those threatening letters. But this morning, we know the family has finally gotten rid of it by taking a major financial loss.
The crazy part, however, is that after the new owners began living in the house, Derek and his wife were expecting the Watcher to start haunting them and sending them similar letters. But according to the new residents, they didn't receive a single letter. This begs the question, if the Watcher suddenly disappeared, then why did the letters mention a cycle of surveillance in which the house is constantly being watched? The obvious answer is that the Broaddus family was specifically being targeted, and someone or something wanted them to leave the house at any cost. Whether the Watcher is a neighbor, a stalker, or a supernatural entity with an actual relationship to the house, it will probably never be revealed, because even today, in 2025, no one knows who sent those chilling letters or why. And by the way, before you assume that this is a hoax invented by the family, let me remind you that both the police and the justice system were involved in this. Because believe it or not, the family went to the extent of spending more money to file a lawsuit against the previous owner and the town itself, but nothing was ruled in their favor.
This large 6-bedroom home in Union County, New Jersey is being watched, at least according to this lawsuit filed by its new owners who paid $1.3 million for their dream home.
In summary, the Watcher story is among the most perplexing mysteries of our generation. And what makes it more intriguing is that the idea of someone secretly watching your house has actually been a scary story for centuries. And so many horror movies and games were made about it. But the reason the Watcher story became more notorious and special is because despite the dedication and effort from police and investigators, no conclusive evidence has ever been found. Which means that if we're dealing with a human, it has to be someone professional who knew very well how to send the letters anonymously, avoid any cameras, and most importantly, see everything the family is doing without looking suspicious.
They hired a number of experts. They hired a former FBI agent to try to create a profile. They hired a private investigator to kind of look around the neighborhood.
In the 1950s, following the aftermath of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and America, a wave of serious hysteria swept through both nations, fueled by uncertainty about what might come next. This hysteria intensified over the years due to several crucial geopolitical events, including the Korean War, which was a major power struggle between America and the Soviet Union. During those days, the American media was broadcasting peculiar stuff about the war, such as footage showing US soldiers in Korea suddenly confessing on camera, and prisoners of war acting unusually obedient, hinting that their behavior is not natural. In other words, the American media and government were trying to convince the people that the Soviets were responsible for this behavior. And the word brainwashing was thrown left and right in newspapers and articles to highlight what possibly happened. US officials were very outspoken about their suspicions regarding mind control, and they made it clear that the communists probably have tools that allow them to influence people's thoughts. This propaganda was intended to spread paranoia among the American population and lead them to believe that the Soviets are very invested in psychological warfare. But strangely enough, instead of Americans focusing on the Soviets, they turned their eyes towards their own government. People began asking a serious question. If the communists can brainwash, then how the heck can we believe that the CIA is not trying to do the same thing? At that time, this question was seen as a joke by many, and the idea of mind control in general was nothing more than a spooky theory meant for entertainment and gossip. However, as time passed, certain individuals in the public began to notice suspicious circumstances happening in the country. A notable example is the mysterious death of Frank Olson in 1953, a very prominent scientist and biologist who used to work with the American Intelligence Agency. Frank was 43 years old when he died, and according to the official story from authorities, he fell from a window in Hotel Pennsylvania during the night, indicating he did it himself. This was incredibly bizarre because Frank was only wearing his underwear when he was found, and the incident happened after midnight, a situation that even the hotel manager highlighted as fishy. Frank Olson's death became a major turning point for skeptics because his role as a government scientist made it difficult for many to believe that no hidden or sinister forces were involved. Nevertheless, throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, citizens across the United States began to spread rumors suggesting that the CIA is secretly conducting experiments on certain individuals to control their minds or create assassins for their dirty job. And speaking of assassins, this notion became more infamous after the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963 at the hands of Lee Harvey Oswald, a 24-year-old soldier who had no criminal history whatsoever. What's even crazier is that before Harvey could even be fully interrogated and explain himself, he was killed 2 days after his arrest by Jack Ruby, a random nightclub owner who justified his action with outlandish arguments. On one hand, he said he did it because of sadness and grief regarding the death of President Kennedy, and on the other hand, he said that he wanted to prove that there are Jews who love the president, noting that he was concerned that the assassination would be blamed on his community as a Jewish person. Either way, both Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby remain puzzling figures to this day, because the public had no idea why Harvey committed this insane plot against the president, or why Jack Ruby reacted to that event in such a senseless manner. This ambiguity led the American people to come up with a million conspiracy theories about the assassination, including the suggestion that both the assassin and his killer have some relationship with the CIA in one way or another. For more than 20 years, from the 1950s all the way to the early 1970s, the idea that the CIA is involved in shady scientific experimentations to control human minds remained an urban legend that some people believe while others dismiss, ridicule, and laugh at. However, in 1975, Senator Frank Church was among the few officials who had a strong belief that some governmental entities are not really transparent. And as a result, he led a special committee to investigate widespread reports of illegal and improper activities by the intelligence agencies and their sister organizations. This was a little bit late because 2 years earlier, in 1973, the CIA director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of highly sensitive files that documented a shocking program within the intelligence agency. But despite this order, many documents survived because of some employees who wanted the truth to be revealed. And in 1976, investigators discovered the dark truth that the CIA was desperately trying to hide for decades. It turns out that in 1953, the CIA started a program known as MK Ultra, and its main goal was literally to develop ways to control or influence human behavior by using chemical substances and manipulating psychology. The primary element that they used heavily for this mission was LSD, which is short for lysergic acid diethylamide, a hallucinogenic drug that's notorious for its powerful psychological effects. Scientists were dying to know if this substance can make someone easier to control or collapse mentally, but in order for them to find the answer, they needed many test subjects. Subsequently, intelligence officers began to prey on the most vulnerable people in society, including prisoners, mental health patients, homeless individuals, and even soldiers with certain problems. In the case of mental patients, they relied heavily on government-run institutions to have more influence on the employees there. And on many occasions, disabled children were a central target because they're easier to handle and no one cares about them, which is tragic on its own. What made it worse is that the experiments were becoming more intense over time, and the scientists were giving LSD to the victims on a daily basis for weeks, making it destructive for their brains. They managed to do this by mixing the LSD into their drinks or food, injecting it into their veins by pretending that it's a casual procedure in the hospital, or inviting soldiers to have a checkup in their base to put the LSD in their regular drugs. The experiments also included putting people through long periods of isolation to test psychological breakdown and whether this can push them to confess easier during interrogations. Furthermore, hypnosis was another obsession for the CIA, and they relied on various dangerous drugs to induce deeper regression and subsequent amnesia, attempting to establish hypnotic control of an individual. In other words, they literally wanted to see if they could delete someone's memory and put them into a trance state, and then give them a command that they would execute later without conscious awareness of any instruction, as if their brains were redesigned to focus on one thing alone subconsciously. The craziest and most ruthless method that the CIA utilized to have more freedom in their experiments was something called Operation Midnight Climax, and it basically consisted of a web of safe houses and civilian buildings that were run by intelligence officers. These supposed safe houses were mostly brothels and apartments that were used to bring in homeless men, drug addicts, alcoholics, or random defenseless civilians on the street. For this operation, the CIA hired sex workers and struggling women to lure and seduce men, and once they arrive in the houses, they get secretly dosed with LSD and other drugs without their knowledge or consent. But the CIA installed cameras and one-way mirrors so they could observe, film, and study the drug's effects on men's behavior in the context of intimacy. They wanted to know how men behave during intimate encounters with women when their minds are heavily drugged, and how manipulated intimacy can be useful for blackmail in intelligence operations. This was disgusting because both the men and women in this experiment were basically puppets in a scripted encounter. Many women were coerced and threatened to engage in these missions, and the men were given a drug that ultimately makes them drown in hallucinations, leading them to do certain behaviors that put women's safety at risk. I don't need to say it explicitly, but I think you can imagine the disturbing stuff that can happen when you put women and unstable men in a closed space meant for intimate pleasure. Another cruel experiment was called psychic driving, and during its process, the patient's mind is reduced to a near-vegetative state through a combination of massive, sustained doses of LSD and extreme, excessive electroconvulsive therapy. When the patient becomes severely weakened or enters a drug-induced prolonged sleep state, they are subjected to continuous, endless repetitions of recorded, looped audio messages. These messages contain specific statements and were played through headphones or speakers, hidden under their pillows for up to 16 hours a day, which is intended to erase the patient's current mental state and implement new ideas or behaviors in their mind to create a new personality. This horrifying procedure was developed by Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, and it was used extensively at the Allen Memorial Institute in Canada, which was secretly funded by the CIA to exploit Canadian mental patients.
The CIA secretly funded the medical experiments through a front in New York City called, of all things, the Society for the Protection of Human Ecology.
Long story short, the urban legend about the CIA's obsession with mind control was true all along. And over the course of many years, thousands of people were exploited by insane scientists who had zero regard for human life. But the plot actually gets more peculiar because the investigations that led to the exposure of MKUltra to the public revealed a shocking secret about Frank Olson. It turned out that Frank did not fall from the window because of his desire to put an end to his misery, but instead, he was actually given LSD unknowingly by none other than the CIA itself, the entity that he worked for. The man who did it was Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist who served as the head of MKUltra. And the reason behind his brutal crime was because Frank wanted to expose the unethical human experiments that the CIA was conducting. Frank was among the scientists involved in psychological studies with the CIA, and apparently he realized how criminal the MKUltra program is when it was presented to him. So following his doubts and rejection, he was seen as a threat and ended up becoming a test subject himself, which ultimately led him to fall from the window because of his hallucinations. He was not the only victim with social prominence, because many CIA employees and personnel were also used in aggressive testing without their consent due to a desire from researchers to see how the drugs can affect educated people. In fact, the most mysterious case to this day remains the one that involves Ted Kaczynski, a man who's been through a mental transformation that destroyed his life. Ted was a brilliant person and a genius mathematician, and to understand how intelligent he was, keep in mind that he became a student at Harvard University at the age of 16. The problem, however, is that studying at Harvard was a curse for him, because in 1959, he was part of an experiment run by psychologist Henry Murray, and strangely enough, this man was a former intelligence researcher. Henry's experiment included intense psychological stress, interrogation, humiliation, deception, and pushing the person he's studying to collapse and fall apart emotionally. Even though it was never confirmed that Henry was part of MKUltra, his methods were very similar to what the CIA did, and both experiments were conducted at the same time as well. Several years after leaving Harvard, Ted's mental health began to deteriorate, and he was living in extreme isolation that eventually drove him to have strong animosity towards technology and scientific institutions. In 1978, he lost his mind entirely, and he started sending homemade bombs through the mail to specific people involved in science, industrial society, or academia. By 1996, when he was arrested, he had killed 3 people and injured 23 others in his campaign of violence that made him an infamous serial killer with zero remorse. To this day, Ted's story is still a perplexing puzzle, because if the experiments he went through in university can turn a genius intellectual person like him into a lunatic murderer, you can only imagine what possibly happened to the other victims under the CIA. Sadly, the officials and scientists who were responsible for all the crimes I mentioned never faced any serious punishment, and only some victims received a form of compensation while the rest were forgotten. Although there's no official evidence regarding their fate, experts believe that many victims have probably gone completely insane, and there are definitely many people who died as a result of the experiments. The horror behind the MKUltra program didn't go away after its shutdown, and even decades later, Americans' trust in the CIA is still in the ground, especially since they never really trusted them to begin with. Which is why the conspiracy theory started as early as the 1950s. But the truly terrifying part is that it's hard to believe that such experiments are really non-existent today, which raises the question about how governments elevated their brutality to become more strategic and exploit innocent people under different pretexts.
And for it to be done properly, One has to have trained individuals who do nothing else and who are used to doing this frequently.
At Ravenscraig, Dr. Cameron went further with drugs and electric shock treatments than any of the U.S. researchers in the MK Ultra project dared. His aim was to wipe the mind clean. Then he would implant new messages by forcing the patient to listen to a hypnotic repetition as many as 250,000 times. This was called psychic driving. Most of the drugs used in the program were experimental and some dangerous.
He was an authoritarian, ruthless, power-hungry, nervous, tense, angry man. Not very nice.
In the early 2000s, the modern internet and online social interactions between people were new concepts that were starting to gain momentum slowly but steadily. Online communication was considered revolutionary, but it eventually became integrated into many aspects of life, including video games. But with companies racing to take advantage of these features, communication evolved into something even more visionary, which is real-time video and audio through webcams and microphones. In case you don't know this due to your young age, when Xbox introduced their online service that allowed voice chatting in 2002, people were literally blown away by the possibility of playing multiplayer console games with their friends and speaking with them simultaneously. A few years later, this idea became mainstream and was a normal expectation in online multiplayer in any game console. And with the rise of social media, webcam use was only increasing, and microphones were basically in every home. This might sound bizarre for you in the 2020s, but back then, many people were afraid that online games were able to record your voice chat secretly, and they wondered whether companies like Sony and Microsoft could listen to private room conversations. Keep in mind that privacy was not a huge conversation at the time, because the legal system was still figuring out how these new technological features really work. The suspicion about what happens behind the scenes during chatting became more serious when cameras were very common, especially since portable consoles like PSP had the ability to use webcams for gaming purposes. Initially, these concerns and theories were not taken very seriously by the general public. Not because people were gullible, but mainly because the whole mechanism of video chatting was so fresh in gaming that average people had no idea how it was really managed.
Okay, now you can talk to anyone you're playing with. Hey, let's call on my buddy the Hunk to help demonstrate. Hey, yo, Hunk.
Hey, what up, Doc?
With that said, in 2008, a very outlandish game was released that would eventually change people's perception of personal webcams and microphones forever, leading the legal system itself to intervene. The game in question is called Hotel 626, and strangely enough, it wasn't made by a regular game developer or publisher, but it was actually produced by none other than Doritos, a brand that's known for selling foods, specifically chips. The game was special because you can only access it through your internet browser, and it was designed to be exclusively available from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. to add a sense of suspense and mystery to the experience.
That's why Hotel 626 is only open from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m.
The story is simple, and it revolves around a man who wakes up at night in his hotel room after hearing a sudden noise. And from that moment, he needs to bypass various spine-chilling challenges and obstacles to escape the terrifying building. The first challenge is going into a dark bathroom and using your camera's flash against a female maid who was imprisoned in the bathroom for a long time and became sensitive to light. The most enticing chapter is the one where you find a little girl sleeping in her bed, and in order to reach the other side, you must walk carefully to avoid waking her up. Besides that, if you want to keep her sleepy, you also need to use a music box to create a nice melody for a child like her. The clever element in this mission is that you can actually use your own voice to sing for her if you choose to use your microphone, which makes your survival much more realistic. The game has an immersive atmosphere where everything around you looks real because all the scenes you're witnessing were actually performed by real people, and you're living the story by making the right moves to escape. You will continue going through spooky stages until you finally come across the area where the horror becomes much more personal than you think. In this section, you find a range of photos that supposedly belong to the victims who died at the hands of a killer in the hotel, but the catch is that these photos are not fictional. The faces you see here are real people who exist in the real world, and to be specific, they are players who were playing the game just like you. In fact, the main purpose of this section is for you to shockingly find your own face here when you're playing. But the real question is, how is this possible? Well, when you launch the game in your browser, a banner usually appears in the corner asking for permission to access your microphone and camera. This is supposedly because you can use these devices in the game in certain stages to have an immersive experience. But the game doesn't really tell you how they will be used exactly. At first, you assume that it's all about explicit missions, such as the one where you sing for the child. But little did you know, the game was actually controlling your webcam the whole time and taking photos of you secretly. And when it comes to the microphone, it's also silently utilized to know precisely when you're screaming or scared in order to determine when it's the best time to save a photo of your face. In other words, throughout your playthrough, both your microphone and webcam are being used to see your face and hear your voice without your knowledge. And this is when the feature becomes much more serious than mere entertainment. Even though it's a smart way to intensify the horror in the game, you should also remember that as long as the game is open in your browser, you're being watched and recorded inside your room while believing you're enjoying the privacy of your own home. This means that private conversations can be caught and your personal moments can be seen and recorded, which is risky if you're someone who does certain activities in their room that are intended to remain a secret. However, Doritos didn't stop here, because 1 year later they released a sequel called Asylum 626. And this time, the insanity goes even further by using your social media to post stuff in your name and show you photos of your friends to surprise you. The craziest mechanic happens in the section where you need to look at the sink to find something. At that moment, if your webcam is working, you will literally see your own face in real time moving in the sink, which can basically give you a heart attack if you're not used to such technology and don't know what the heck is going on. What made all these mechanics ridiculously impressive is that we're talking about the year 2008 here, a time when people were barely getting used to first-person horror games, let alone a game where you see your own face inside without any warning or explanation. Some of you might argue that what the game does with the webcam is legitimate because they ask for permission beforehand, but legally and morally, that's not the case at all. The permission that the game uses is vague and meant to deceive the player by hiding the real reason behind using your devices, which is actually illegal under the law. When I personally contacted a friend to explain this detail to me as a lawyer, he told me that it's not legal for a website to secretly use your webcam just because you once clicked allow. Because even if you press the button, the law generally requires clear, informed, and ongoing consent, not hidden or deceptive use. This is the case in most countries worldwide, and in the US specifically, it violates the Federal Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, and video voyeurism laws. It's explicitly illegal to lie about camera usage, capture a photo of someone without clear permission, or record someone's voice secretly. This is why multiple consumer groups and the Federal Trade Commission filed a complaint back in 2011 against Doritos and its mother company Pepsi, accusing them of using sneaky practices targeted at teenagers, which includes collecting data under the guise of video games. In the same year, both Hotel 626 and Asylum 626 were removed from the internet, and no statement has ever been released from Doritos about the project, making it seem like they want people to forget that it ever existed. The irony, however, is that what began as an urban legend in the 2000s has now become completely normal in modern life. Social media made privacy intrusion far easier, since simply creating an account often means consenting to the collection of your messages, search history, and much more. With that being said, there's no doubt that Hotel 626 is the most creative horror game of the 21st century. And the controversy behind it makes it hard for any other game to try the same concept, because there are actual legal consequences for it.
Why didn't you pick up the phone? Listen, if you want to get out of here alive, do exactly as I say. There isn't that much time. Quick, head down the hallway. Trying to help you. Go left.
Anyway, this is all I have for today, and I only chose to highlight 3 specific topics because I wanted to explain them thoroughly and in detail. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like it, and let me know in the comments below if you want similar content in the future. See you next time.
Enough for today. Please shut the camera off. Shut it off now. Please shut it off now.